What's up, YouTube faithful? Ran through my ManaTraders qualifying matches earlier, and this is what happened. So, all I can say that I decided to play some Dimir Shadow. I know that Sultai has been like the flavor of the week, but I haven't really found like a configuration that I'm hugely impressed by yet. So I figured I would just like knock this out with old tried and true, throw some Murktides at people. We've talked a little bit about some card choices here and there in the list, and for the most part, the bulk is pretty stock, but there's a few flex spots. Like decided not to play the fourth Murktide, play the Brazen Borrower instead, and like the Shieldred's Edict over one of these extra draw spells I've been playing. Mainly because I wanted a little more flexibility in the main. I didn't know what I was going to be running into, but I thought that I wanted some more like catch-all answers, like Shieldred's Edict being really good against Planeswalkers in case we see a bunch of like creativity or grist. And then like Brazen Borrower being good against non-land permanents like Blood Moon and Chalice of the Void and some of these like generic catch-all pieces people are playing. In the sideboard, I think it's like the exact 15 that I've been running for a few weeks now. A couple Flusterstorm, the fourth Stubborn Denial, Dress Down, Hurkyl's Recall, two Spreading Seas, Path of Peril, a couple Turok, Shieldred's Edict, Fatal Push, Chalice of the Void, EE, Unlicensed Hearse. I've been like pretty happy with the sideboard, so I don't feel like a big need to make any adjustments here or there. Main deck, think the biggest questions are like the third Stubborn Denial, the fourth Drown in the Lock, the 20th land. In the case of this list, the Shieldred's Edict, the Brazen Borrower, all those are kind of like question marks, but figured I'd see how they do. And the only way to check that out is to run it. So this is our first match of the qualifiers. Microphone cord coming loose. So lose the die roll. Okay, opening hand. We've got some cantrips and fetch land, so we know we can get Murktide online pretty quickly. Obviously, we need to find some interaction. Wraith and a couple Sultai colored lands means we're probably up against the Sultai Shadow list. So if you haven't seen this list, uses like Vampire Hexmage, Invasion of Ikoria to get this 8/8 dude into play. 8/8 dinosaur that lets you deal damage as if your stuff wasn't blocked. So kind of have to keep an eye out for that. Thankfully, cards like Drown in the Lock, Dress Down are pretty solid against them. Fatal Push, Archmage's Charm for Shadows. So we've got a lot of very reasonable pieces to kind of handle this matchup. Taking advantage of this fetch here to Drown and Lock the Tarmogoyf while they can't hold up Stubborn Denial. One thing that we did find when I was kind of trying out the Sultai list, and then I'm hoping to take advantage in this match, is they are very, very light on actual interaction. It's like 4 Fatal Pushes, 2 Stubborn Denials, and then like Grist, and that's about it in the main deck. Like Grist is their only way of actually dealing with the Murktide Regent. So here I'm kind of hoping that they'll kill the Shadow and let me resolve Murktide next turn safely, but instead they tick up and play a Shadow of their own. So I'll take the opportunity with one card left on their side to just try to like swipe their Shadow. And now I've got the 2 big threats plus Murktide in the wings. Then finding Fatal Push and Brazen Borrower means like if they gang block something, then I can kill something off. If not, I'm just going to like flood the board with guys, which is exactly what you see here. I could have, I always like to stop these videos at crucial points and try to think about like what I could have done differently. I could have Fatal Pushed the Dryad Arbor. Oh, microphone or camera going all over the place. I could have Fatal Pushed the Dryad Arbor and Petty Thefted the Hex Mage, and then had like a clean kill shot on the Grist, and play the Murktide afterwards, and that would have been fine. I don't think it's like a huge percentage play because at the end of the day, I'm pretty okay with them like dropping down Grist to kill the Murktide because I just have a bunch of shadows and a petty theft. So, kind of like in this situation, hey, I'm going to go to my turn to play around Stubborn Denial, but I'm just going to hey, bounce the Goyf, attack in. If they have a fatal push, I can dress down to make my other shadow lethal. So ultimately, I feel kind of okay. Sideboarding against this deck, I think my main game plan was just like take out some of my Thought Seizes and Wraith, bring in like the extra fatal push, EE, unlicensed hearse, the Shieldred's Edict in the board, and then I brought in like a Turok because I just had another spot I wanted to board out. But here we're just gonna go with the tried and true, play out a bunch of shadows and see what happens. Reasonable shot. Our opponent's got a fatal push here. So be it. Fetch shock, invasion for a shadow. So if I find like a fetch land, they're dead. Or if I just find a second dismember, they're dead. So now I get to dismember, hold priority, dismember again, kill the shadow, grow my shadow up to lethal, attack in. Nice. 2-0 start. On to match number 2. We win this die roll. Really good hand. Fetch shock, Thoughtseize. We've got a shadow. The Thoughtseize decision there. Esper Sentinel, Memnite, bunch of lands. Esper Sentinel's best thing in the hand that I can take. Memnite I don't really care about. But we're up against Hammer. Top deck aid is pretty good because that means they are going to be able to get down or get a hammer equipped onto something. All right. Options here. I could play the Murktide, or I could play out the Shadow and hold up the Stubborn Denial, or I could just pass holding up Drown. Ultimately, the only way that I get punished for Drown is, or for passing with Murktide, is if their top draws were like Pure Steel Paladin plus Hammer, and they get to draw a card, but I still get to kill the Pure Steel with Drown. So I'm not that afraid of that. Ultimately, I just want to get down like a good clock here so that I can start attacking and hold up counter spells behind it and hopefully win the game that way. And instead of our opponent playing anything, they're just going to go for tokens. So we'll kill tokens as they matter. Essentially, if a token doesn't actually matter, there's not really a big reason to kill it. And since we just have like a 2-turn clock, our opponent's got this Ink Moth Nexus. Our only big concern here is like a Surge of Salvation. So we drown in the lock into turn, try to bait the Surge if they have it and want to use it. They don't, which means we get to go to our turn, attack, attempt to fatal push the Ink Moth. We can beat a Surge with Stubborn Denial. If they have double Surge, then it's annoying, but ultimately, like, the Ink Moth still dies because the Murktide is not a red or black source dealing damage to it. And we just have the same attack next turn. So, yeah. This is game number 2. Sideboarding against Hammertime is usually trimming on like Wraiths and Thought Seizes, boarding in Hercule's Recall, boarded in Fatal Push, Shieldred's Edict, Dress Down, EE. I think that's about it. A lot of trimming of the stuff I don't want to be drawing late. It's like there's a reasonable chance in this matchup that you're going to get hit with a creature strapped up with a hammer early. So drawing like Thought Seizes and Street Wraiths early is kind of okay because you can kind of tank that first hit. but drawing them late after you've taken a hit is basically completely dead. Also, I want to point out in these matchups against like Hammertime, something that I don't think people take enough of an advantage of is when your opponent goes turn 1 land, turn 2 Urza Saga, there is such a good chance that they're going to spend turn 3 playing land pass. And then maybe even turn 4, like activating Saga again, get something up, and might not have another play after that. So when your opponent leads on like a turn 2 Urza Saga, it's a really good time to establish your board position. Like we saw game number 1, we played out the Murktide. Game number 2 here, we're playing out this Shadow. We have like interaction we can hold up, but getting on the board, getting the pressure going is way more likely to be pretty substantially impactful. And then I could like end of my turn dress down and stop, like kill the construct plus stop its construct on their turn. But I really want them to do like this and commit the mana to the construct and then dress down. Because even if they have a spell pierce, I've got stubborn denial and I can fight over that, kill the constructs, untap, have my shadow plus Archmage's charm, whatever. But just gives my opponent a chance to like do something to spend all their mana. So this is round number 3. Reasonable hand again. Got a bunch of cantrips. Really hoping to find another land. My opponent leads Plains Aether Vial, so I'm assuming like a Taxes deck, but they're on a mold of 5, so that's really good. I've not seen Taxes play Urza Saga. Doesn't mean that they don't, just I haven't seen it. Decided I wanted to go ahead and fetch and chalk here in case they were playing like Leonin Arbiter. Again, don't know why they would play Leonin Arbiter with Urza Saga, but I didn't really know what I was up against, so I'm just assuming at this point it's like a standard Urza Saga, some sort of cheap creature Vial deck. But obviously, with my opponent ticking up Vial over and over again, I'm no longer sure. Dress down before they tutor up anything. Wasn't really expecting Soul Guide Lantern, but when they pass to my turn, like I'll take the opportunity to just get down my Murktide. Is it pretty? No. Does it give me a play on the battlefield? Yes. So down to 2 cards. Aether Vials up to 4. They've got an Arid Mesa in hand because they get to Thought Seize the Portable Hole, and a Spellskite with a Shadow Spear. So I have no idea, again, what I'm up against, but I feel like I'm in reasonable shape. Some sort of like probably Artifacts Matter deck with Spellskite and Portable Hole. And Urza Saga kind of gives that away. Like, yeah, this is something artifact related. Opponent decides not to spin Urza. I could Archmage's Charm to try to steal the construct and attack. But then my opponent's kind of got the free information of, hey, just block the shadow with Urza and untap with a construct. And I think they would be able to kill me. Make a construct, untap, make a construct. It's a 3/3, 4/4 with Shadow Spear. So yeah, they'd be able to kill me with that. So instead, I'm going for this line of like attack with both. If my opponent blocks, or no, I end up killing. I want to kill the construct before damage. I figure my opponent's going to make a construct, which they do. Kill the lifelink construct before damage. If they block with the Urza, then I can dismember the other construct, go to 1, and go to their turn, as long as they don't have like a was it Ginger Brute, then I should be okay. The other option is if they block with the Construct token, then I can just ignore the Urza because the Urza is not killing me. So that's what we end up doing. Just like pass, let them have the Urza. There's not really a reason to dismember it. I don't want to dismember this Construct token because then they know I'm dead to the Urza. I just kind of want them to pass and do nothing. Looks like they're going to spin Urza, hit another Saga. That's pretty cool. So as long as they cannot get rid of both of my threats, I've got lethal here by being able to kill one, untap, kill the other. Since they do not activate the Urza, like I think they were supposed to not spin and just have the not spin and have the Aether Vial or Aether Spellbomb up, but whatever. Sideboarding, boarded out some counter spells and stubs because they showed like Urza, Saga, Aether Vial, and Counterspell and Stub are both very bad against those. Trim on some Street Wraiths. Brought in a whole bunch of stuff. Brought in like Dress Down. Let's see. Dress Down, EE, Hercule's Recall, Spreading Seas. Both copies of Spreading Seas. Something else. It'll come to me eventually. Boarded in. I don't think I boarded in the extra Shieldred's Edict. But either way, Esper Sentinel starts pretty good against us, especially on the draw. Turn to your Goblin Engineer for Thopter Sword. So now we know we're up against the Thopter Sword deck. We probably could have assumed that from Urza game 1, but I didn't really want to assume it. Thoughtseize the Vial. Opponent's just got a couple lands, but they do have this Engineer and this Sentinel. Hercule's Recall, pretty good top deck. So now we can like recall the entire board at some point, maybe. Kill the Goblin Engineer because I don't really want him getting back like Vial or looping Spell Bomb, something like this. All right. So Hercule's Recall, go ahead and bounce the board. This is mostly just like a defensive recall to kind of give myself a little time to help set up. Like it's not great, but I just need to buy myself a little time. There's nothing really to make me believe that their hand is extraordinarily strong. And punished for not doing this when they tapped out. I thought about it, but then I was like, oh, I want to hold up Drown and Lock in case they play like an Urza or something next turn. Needless to say, they did not play an Urza. So either way, we get to consider pretty aggressively refill our graveyard. Spreading Seas takes out the Urza Saga. We get Murktide back down. Opponent draws and scoops. So I'm assuming they just don't have a way of dealing with Murktide, or they thought like, hey, I didn't draw an answer this turn. They probably have Counterspell after this. I'm just going to scoop it up. So the cool thing with these matches is we are like 4-0, 3-0, 6-0 at this point, or something like that. 4-0, 8-0. Haven't dropped a game yet. Thoughtseize, so we're up against the Urza Saga Underworld Breach deck. Underworld Breach, Grinding Station, that stuff. They are in a hand of basic Island Urza Saga with like Breach to Fairy in hand. So them finding another Urza Saga is like annoying for the constructs, but not annoying from the no good mana standpoint. So luckily we're able to find a threat, get that down. We've got Dress down to help answer Saga tokens if they happen to make one here. So reasonable spot to be in. Springleaf Drum is solid. So now if we can't deal with their threats, which luckily we can, they would have a pretty good way of like getting back into the game with Teferi. But instead we just get to like Thoughtseize the Teferi, steal the Ragavan, get in a big hit with Shadow. And now we've got Odawara to bounce a Construct if we need to. Instead, we get Aether Spellbomb, Ledger Shredder. It's kind of funny to see like Aether Spellbomb decks back to back here. It's not at all what I was expecting to run into. Find their Expressive Iteration, so of course we're going to cast that. Finding a counterspell off of it's pretty sick as well, so. Hey, here's our Shadow again. We've got a Murktide and a counterspell. We know your last card is Underworld Breach plus the blind draw off of the bauble there. So we're just going to have, like, in this case, your Emery, but our Murktide plus hold up counterspell. Like, we could sit on Murktide and not play it out and still have lethal, but I feel like it doesn't do much harm to just play it out. I can't think of a combination they could have with 2 lands, an Aether Vial, or 2 lands, the Springleaf Drum, and one of their 3 cards being a Underworld Breach. Sideboarding against this deck, really similar to the last match. Just bring in like EE, Spreading Seas, Hurkyl's Recall, Unlicensed Hearse. That's about it. Get to see Spreading Seas do some good work here, taking out a Saga, drawing us into a Scalding Tarn to help get these shadows online. Obviously, I'm very happy to see shadows right here instead of Murktide. We even get to grow our shadows while simultaneously knocking out this expressive iteration. Pretty cool. Okay. I don't think it's not this turn, so we won't talk about it just yet. But if you're watching along at home, hopefully your wheels are kind of turning here with how you're going to win this game. And how that Teferi just sealed the deal for you. So if we hadn't have drawn the fetch land, we would have cracked the Fiery Islet first to maybe find one, because I guess it wouldn't have worked if we cracked the Fiery Islet. But we get to just play out our shadow, use our Fiery Islet and our dismember our own shadow, make this other shadow exactly lethal. So one of the pieces of advice I always give people when they're picking up shadow in the first place is just about every turn, like, stop for a second and say, hey, like, what can I do to finish off my opponent right here? Is there any line I have that lets me just win the game? And you'll find a lot of times that there are some lines here and there that just in the game. So we're up against Karuga Elementals. Decided to take the Fury because if I can, I would like to get this Murktide down as quickly as possible. And it might mean playing the Murktide out as a 4/4. And if that's the case, like, I don't want Fury killing it. So decided to take the Fury and, like, here just risk them possibly of finding something to deal with the Murktide. But if they don't, I get to untap and have double counter spell or whatever the case may be. Like if they did find a solitude, again, I've got counter spell. So I feel like I've got some ways out of it. They do end up having like double tap effect here. I let the second one go because like the last thing I want to do here is tap off of a counter spell in the face of like a solitude. Sideboarding against this elementals deck. Stubborn Denial is not the worst because usually they do have like Teferi and Leyline Binding and some of that kind of stuff. Drowning Lock's a little bit bad because they are playing big 5-mana elementals and they probably have endurance. Dress Down's good for stopping the ETB effects. Fatal Push, pretty bad. Yeah, that's about it. A lot of the elemental sideboard plans are kind of the same. Like, board out some of the bad, cheap interaction, board in stuff that hopefully stifles some elemental plays here and there. Thoughtseize Solitude, because we know we're going to be able to get down the Shadow turn 2. And all we're kind of hoping for is like maybe our opponent doesn't endurance and we get down Murktide on turn 3, but they just go for the main phase 1. So let that resolve, and then we get like a free dismember on this endurance. Really help out our clock here. I could have considered to try to find a fetch land and make this a 2-turn clock, but I really wanted to get the shadow down and just hold up stub so that if I did find a way off this consider to deal with like the endurance, then I could just have the game over that way. So in a case like this, our opponent having ice for a shadow, we get to eat it with a stub. Cool. All right, so this is match number 6. One of the things that they changed with the ManaTraders qualifiers that I did not know is if you win your very first 6 matches, you automatically qualify. It used to be like you have to go 7 of your first 10, but they changed it. So if you do straight up 6 straight wins, then you qualify automatically. If you've been keeping track at home, we are currently 5-0, 10-0 in matches. So all we got to do is win this match, and we automatically qualify thanks to the updated rule set. Stomping Ground, suspend some Rhinos. We've got Thoughtseize. We've got Murktide. Opponent's got a Dead and Gone, but they only have 2 lands right now, so maybe there's a shot. But you know Rhinos, like they've had 2 blind draws, and those blind draws are 3rd land Shardless Agent. So we'll take the opportunity to just bounce one of these Rhinos. How we could get a Murktide down, but we know they've got Dead and Gone in hand. So instead, we're just gonna sit here, pass a turn. Now we can get down Murktide, hold up counter spell, and kind of hope that's good enough. There's Dead and Gone. There's counter spell. Get more Rhinos, so we really need to find like a shadow or something relevant, but we just find like some wraiths and thought seizes. So tough one there. Sideboarding against Rhinos, EE, Chalice definitely coming in. Bluster Storm, Stubborn Denial, all really good. And then just trimming on some of the stuff like Shieldred's Edict and some Street Wraiths, just try to slim down a little bit. I'm also okay with trimming on like Archmage's Charm, since you're bringing in Flusterstorm and an extra Stubborn Denial, just like be more mana efficient with your counters. So we get double Murktide into Dead and Gone, Subtlety, Brazen Borrower. Very, very rough hand to see multiple Murktide against. And they top deck an Endurance. So we knew their hand was exactly Subtlety, Brazen Borrower, Dead, Gone, or then an Unknown. And the fact that that Unknown happens to be Endurance, really rough for this opener. So not a lot to do here. Unfortunately, like even with trimming a fourth Murktide, sometimes it just doesn't line up well. Second Endurance is pretty decent. Now we're just hoping to find like some way to enable Murktide and protect it. So like a Thoughtseize here would be really good. Consider's not bad. But top deck the Violent Outburst. So we're going to end up having to play the Murktide. Yeah, like we could have kept the Flusterstorm, but we knew they had the Subtlety, so I don't think Flusterstorm would have really mattered. I played against a blue-white control player the other day, and one of the sentiments I took away from it was so much like blue-white control has to draw pretty hot to win in today's environment. And I think I'm getting to the point of putting Rhinos in kind of a similar category. Like, yeah, you're going to have some number of games where you open up with 3 lands and a Cascade spell, and like you do the thing and you get there. But there's a lot of games that people are prepared for that. You have to hit some pieces to make it work. Like you've got to hit the Blood Moon for the lockout, or you've got to hit the petty theft at the right time for the chalice or the void mirror or whatever. So I think Living End is a little more straightforward, but all right. So second game, Catcher or Triumph could mean creativity, but Misty means it's probably Rhinos again. Which if it is Rhinos, like our hand's not bad. We've got a whole bunch of counter spells for Rhinos. We've got a threat with Shadow. Now we've got a second threat. We just kind of want to see some lands. Oh, look, more Rhinos. But we are going to counter this one. And now we're going to get into this spot that I really like with this Dimir Shadow deck is, hey, you're just not going to resolve something relevant again. Like, you can hit me, that's fine. I'll get down to threat. But we're just not going to deal with like these Rhino shenanigans. They could have Mystical Dispute. I'd have Fatal Push for a Rhino, but I can still like untap, play out Double Shadow, hold up Counterspell. Since I drew Stubborn Denial, I figured I would just hold on to my counters this turn instead of playing out the second Shadow. My concern is mostly like Fury, but I know I could play out Double Shadow and counterspell the Fury. I just feel like it's not really something that I have to deal with right this second. Or I don't want to like commit all of my resources to dealing with a Fury. Thoughtseize Murktide's really good because now I get an attack with Shadow, play second Shadow, have Stub up. Not really sure why they scooped there. I wasn't streaming these games, so I know they couldn't have been watching me. But regardless, sideboarding, bring in like EE, Chalice, Fluster Storms, trimming again on like some Children's Edict, Fatal Push, Street Wraith, something to that effect. Counter the stub or counter the fire and ice, mostly just to stop the draw. I don't like really care about the tapping my land. It's more, hey, I've got this EE and Shadow Flusterstorm. Like, let me just fight over stuff at my pace. Then this was another situation where I think I was probably respecting Fury too much. And maybe I should have just fetch shock, played double Shadow. But I was kind of thinking, oh, they're going to attack me. I could play double Shadow next turn or a Shadow, whatever the case may be. Now I've got fetch shock to grow Shadow past Fury. I also I don't like how I played this turn. So my opponent goes for an outburst in response to my second Shadow. I want to fetch shock so that I can't get like gotcha'd by a fiery or not a fiery island, what's it called? Dead and Gone or anything. Which I think I might have been too low on life anyway, but whatever. I just figured I wanted all of my mana available before I made any sort of play. And I have the option to just Flusterstorm this, let my shadows resolve past the turn, and have like EE in case they main phase some Rhinos, or Drown in the Lock if they do just about anything else. And I kind of decided like, hey, I've got the answer to the Rhinos in EE. I've got two Shadows, so they don't have any profitable attacks. I'll just like let the Rhinos resolve, play out my EE on 0, pass the turn, and plan on like cracking EE on their end step, or even just going to my turn and cracking EE. And the plan was like fine for the most part, except it really gets wrecked by Murktide here. Because now my Drown can't kill Shardless Agent. They have a lethal Murktide if I use this Fiery Islet to crack EE into turn. Just kind of an awkward spot. And so I should have said, yeah, I'm just going to go to my turn, crack the EE. But I forgot that this Drown in the Lock was shut off by the Murktide, because I was planning on crack the EE, untap, Drown in the Lock the Shardless Agent, attack if I found like a land or whatever, and force the chump block on one of the Shadows. But then I realized, oh, they don't have a graveyard. I can't drown. Dang. So then I end up just dying to this Murktide in what should have been a very preventable sequence. But again, I could have just like stubborn denied the Rhinos or Flusterstorm the Rhinos, kept the EE. Next turn, been able to attack into the Shardless Agent and the Murktide, kill the Shardless Agent, pass the turn. If they went for Violent Outburst into Rhinos, the Rhinos would resolve first, put a third card in their yard. It would be Fetch Land, Shardless Agent, Crashing Footfalls. I could Drown in the Lock the Violent Outburst so that they couldn't kill me with the +1/+0 on Murktide, and then untap and EE away the Rhinos and attack in without blockers. So, like, I had plenty of good plays I could make by just not letting the Rhinos resolve, and just didn't. But either way, on to game 3 in this one. We do end up mulliganing, but our mulligan's like okay. We've got stub, we've got shadow, dismember, borrower. It's like we got some stuff to do. So get down, find this chalice and get it down. Which we're gonna try to protect through Brazen Borrower. And we've got a little draw go period here. Luckily, our chalice on 0 doesn't do anything to us since we have no Mishra's baubles. When they got second island, like I kind of figured they have a blood moon. I thought they would go for it, but I kind of figure if I hold off on this petty theft as long as I can, then or hold off on like fetching, I can get basic island petty theft to blood moon. I maybe should have just thought seized here because it could fetch shock thought seize. If they have nothing, I could fetch shock shadow. If they have something, then I could just hold up the second fetch to get an island to like bail me out from blood moon. But obviously I'm ecstatic when they go for this fiery islet or crack the fire islet. I'm just trying to find like one more land so that I can really unlock my hand. Force a negation. Thought about drowning, but I wanted my basic too bad in case they had blood moon. My fear was like I go for drown, they mystical dispute my drown, and then untap and just like play blood moon, and the game's over. When I don't really have to play into that. So once I committed to fetching, then it became like, all right, just let it go. So they do find another Brazen Borrower. They have a chance to resolve something decent here, which they go for Footfalls and a Murktide. So the immediate thought is like, oh, we're in some trouble. They've got a Murktide. They've got 10 power worth of dudes past Murktide. Finally, we draw this extra land. So thankfully, that extra land, despite being late, is in a good spot. So we can actually get down Shadow plus Murktide and hold up Stubborn Denial. Important to note that I did tap off the Watery Grave intentionally here and held up the island so that if my opponent does go for like Blood Moon into something, I could just choose to let the Blood Moon resolve and have Stubborn Denial up still. Which they do end up going for the moon. The only reason I ended up going for the Stubborn Denial here is because they left up double island. And I kind of figured, like, okay, if their plan is to ice down one of my threats, then I get to, like, have my threat or have, let's say they ice down Shadow and attack in with Murktide. Then, or ice down Murktide, attack with their Murktide, then I get the opportunity to like petty theft their Murktide on my turn, or if they attack with Murktide and Rhino, I can block the Rhino, take the Murktide, Shadow outgrows the Rhino, and then like petty theft the Shardless Agent for lethal. So I decided to just counter the Blood Moon because I don't care about the follow up if it's just off some islands. Then they play Ketria Triome tapped, so maybe they were trying to Blood Moon, let it resolve, play an untapped Triome, and have Brazen Borrower to flash in. Go ahead and Petty Theft the Murktide because I have the lands to pay for Mystical Dispute. They replay a big 4-4 or 3-3 Murktide, and for whatever reason just decide to scoop there. They have a Brazen Borrower, I have a Brazen Borrower, so we're kind of on parity on the Brazen Borrower front. My Murktide can't be just like double blocked, so that's probably the reason. All right, so this is game number or match number 7, 8, I think. And this is kind of one of the reasons I really like running Consider in this deck, is because obviously a one lander looks awful, but with Consider, maybe you have a chance of drawing out of it. In this case, mill some cards, find the land, and all of a sudden this like one land keep with Consider is functional. Because all I had to do was find the second land. And I just unlocked Drown, Counterspell, Drown, Thoughtseize. Luckily, we don't care about a Chalice of the Void on 0 with our 0/0 drop deck. But we do care about a Chalice on 1. Now, opponent's got a Binding, a Solitude, Prismatic Ending. We've got, hopefully, the ability to Archmage's Charm and draw some cards. We're just trying to hit some land drops. Counterspell, pretty good top deck for them. And I decided to just throw down the Murktide here. Like, they've got the Murktide answered plenty of ways. They can untap, Leyline Binding, all 4 mana, and get the Murktide that way. Obviously, I would try to Counterspell, and then they would have, like, Solitude, pitch this Prismatic Ending, and kill the Murktide with that. They could, if they find another land, they might be able to Leyline Binding for like 2 and hardcast Solitude the turn after, or like Leyline Binding for 2, Kahira to hand, evoke Solitude off Kahira, something like that. But I need something to go in my favor to have a chance here. So decided to play out the Murktide and pass. They do find another land, but they pass back, and I get to hold up all of my counter magic now. So now when they go for Leyline Binding and I have Counterspell for the Binding, where they should have evoked Solitude in response to my Counterspell to play around Drown, they don't. And now I just get Drown and lock up. And I know they have Solitude, Prismatic Ending, Unknown. I get to counter the Solitude. Hope they don't have a Spell Pierce. Luckily dodge that. And now I know their last card is Prismatic Ending. And I just have to pray upon pray upon pray that they do not top deck a Supreme Verdict. Which means if you have ever played a Death Shadow deck before with Stubborn Denial or any sort of counter magic, one of these low threat density decks that's relying on Protect the Queen, you know from the bottom of your stomach when you're in this situation, you know what's going to happen. You know. There's no doubt in your mind as soon as you get to this spot and you're like, hey, anything my opponent top decks that they're going to put on the stack, I am going to drown and lock it. Does not matter what it is. Ah. You have top decked the Supreme Verdict. The only thing that gets you out of this spot. Anything else up to a 6 drop gets counterspelled, and you only got 6 mana, so yep. We'll do the whole dress down, song and dance. You know, play a couple turns, try to find another threat, take away Prismatic Ending, so they're empty-handed, but they've got a Kahira. which they're going to play out and offer it up to dismember. And we're going to do the whole thing where we want to find a threat, but we don't. We find some lands and some Shieldred's edicts. They find some memory deluges. And you remember that comment I made with Rhinos earlier, in that I think Rhinos and blue-white control are the two decks that just have to top deck like very, very well, or they just kind of crumble. And I think this is the case of that. Like, hey, I found a Murktide region. That's pretty good. Ah, you top decked a counterspell. That's pretty also good. Maybe I'll find another threat. You're over there not playing anything, so I'm kind of figuring you've found stuff. Here's a shadow and another solitude. Yep. We'll move on. We'll move on. So this is on to game 2, sideboarding against blue-white control, mostly just boarding out like fatal pushes, dismembers, boarding in any sort of like Flusterstorm you have available. And definitely boarding in Turok. Turok's like your big haymaker in the matchup, that if you can see that and resolve that, you feel like you have a reasonable chance. But we're also getting to see one of my favorite aspects of the Death Shadow archetype in general. And it's the fact that even when you're playing against a horrendous matchup, which obviously like Prismatic Ending, Leyline Binding, Solitude, Supreme Verdict, that's a horrendous, Teferi Time Reveler, that's a horrendous matchup for us. Everything they play is awful. Chalice of the Void, it's all terrible to see. But some number of these matchups, or this matchup, any bad, horrible matchup, can be won by just going Fetch Shock Thoughtseize, Fetch Shock Shadow, Hold Up Counter Magic, Pray. And that's kind of what we get to see a glimpse of here. Is we're just gonna Wraith and Thoughtseize and take your answer to the Shadow, the Teferi, and then you're gonna deal with that first threat. We're gonna get down to second threat, have counter magic, and pray to all things holy, and hope we get there. So here's a Murktide hitting you in the face. So the only thing I care about is Solitude. This is 100% an attempted bait Fiery Island. I've got one card in hand. I know my card can answer anything. Let me see if I can just get them to fire something off. And they absolutely go for the Solitude, which we have the Drown for, so we get to get the kill there. Again, Fetch Shock Thoughtseize, Fetch Shock Shadow, get some attacks in. They finally deal with it, drop another threat, close the game out. Game 3 on the draw. This hand is not very exciting, but I'm kind of hoping it just has like an answer to Teferi. It's got a cantrip. Brazen Borrower can deal with like Chalice of the Void, stuff like that. So it's not that I think the hand is good. I'm just hoping it might be good enough. So I go for Windmill Slam at Teferi. I get to Petty Theft the Chalice of the Void. So I know I'll at least get to like untap and Shieldred's Edict the Teferi. Assuming they're just going to go right back to Chalice again. But I did. Now I have to decide between Otawara or Borrower. Obviously, if I had like a Shadow or a Murktide in hand, this would be a lot easier. I would just know, hey, I'm gonna like bounce the Chalice, Thoughtseize, Shadow. Obviously, this is quite depressing on the Shadow side when you play from here or something. So we're gonna bounce the Chalice into turn. Go to our turn, get the Thoughtseize in, and just see Solitude, Solitude, Binding, Prismatic Ending, Verdict, whole bunch of stuff we don't really want to deal with. They are stuck on 4 lands. Like, if they stumble for a couple turns, maybe we have a chance of, like, Flash in Borrower, Archmage's Charm to counter something, but, you know, first draw after that's just the counter spell. Counter spell and to find the 5th land. Yep. I would. It's obviously hand dependent. Like, you're going to have hands against blue-white control where you're very much able to play a more controlling route. But for the most part, in matchups like this, you kind of have to force the proactivity. Like, make your opponent have the thing some amount of the time, because if they do, like, they're probably going to have it anyway. If they don't, though, you might be able to steal a game in an otherwise horrible matchup. It's not always the case that that's how it plays out, but a reasonable amount of the time. But here we get Turok. I figure if I get Turok kicked, they have to Verdict to answer it. So maybe if they end up like ditching Verdict, Solitude or something, then I have a chance to get down Turok, hold up Stub. But their blind draw was Archmage's Charm. So their blind draws were just counter spell into 5th land for Solitude, into Archmage's Charm. And this again is that commentary of like, hey, if you're running blue-white control or Rhinos, you better draw hot, because if you don't, you're going to be in some trouble. Got a Kira. Draw to see if we find an answer to it or like a threat, because obviously we want a threat more than anything. But even if we get Murktide down, we know that they have Solitude, Binding, and Verdict. I could counter the Binding, but then they just get to Solitude it. Ultimately, I think my only out, I say very loosely, is like another Turok. And anything else is going to be pretty lacking. So just flashback Deluge. Counter that, kind of hoping that they'll spend their turn like Verdict or something. But just find another Leyline Binding. And then Binding, obviously, allowing them to hold up like Solitude and stuff is terrible. I could just play out the Street Wraith, but my opponent can just Solitude my Street Wraith, attack in, then I have to deal with like a Solitude on board, which obviously they're not aggressively casting out, I guess, for fear that I can answer it. So there's not really much of a reason to like give them a target for that play that they're not making. So this is match number 9. We're 6-2. Yeah, 6-2. We got to pick up our 7th win within our first 10 to qualify, or else we have to keep playing more Magic. But on to match number 9. Opponent does have a turn 1 Ragavan. Delta for Blood Crypt makes me think it's like a scam deck. And then Bloodstained Mire, no companions. Like, I'm pretty positive it's scam. Just gonna hold up, draw in the lock a turn, kind of get some more information. I figure with the fetch land that they have, if they have to fetch to play like a Blood Moon or Seasoned Pyromancer, Fable of the Mirror Breaker, whatever, I probably just want Drown in the Lock up. They go for Dash Ragavan, and I decide to counter instead of waiting for it to resolve, so that if they have like third land Spell Pierce, now that they've shown me blue, they can't counter my Drown in the Lock back. But they don't have third land, so instead we just get to roll out our shadows and say, cool. Expressive Iteration's all right. Like, I think if they play out a threat, we'll be able to kill them. Obviously, Fatal Pushing my Shadow is not a threat. But finding a Street Wraith to fetch Shock with your Shadow and your opponent's at 11 life is kind of a threat, right? Then we'd be able to play out Murktide, hold up Drown in the Lock. So I'm not really sure at this point what my opponent's on, because I'm seeing a lot of pieces for like an Underworld Breach list, like a fair Breach deck with Ragavan, Iteration, that sort of stuff. But there's no Giganta. So I don't know if this is like a Shadow build or just like Grixis Murktide or Grixis Underworld Breach, but I feel like Breach would be playing Bolt or Heat instead of Push. So my sideboarding is kind of just under the expectation this is like a Grixis mid-range list. Board out some Wraiths. I could board in Turoks, but for the most part, I feel like boarding out some Wraiths, boarding in like EE because I saw Ragavan, so I'm assuming Ledger Shredder, Dragon's Rage Channeler. Board in the Unlicensed Hearse, and board in Fatal Push, Shieldred's Edict, some of that stuff. Just kind of expecting like those Grixis-y, mid-rangey kind of threats. Keep a hand that's very weak to a turn 1 Ragavan if they have it, but if they don't, or if you just draw a Fatal Push, then I feel pretty good. If you saw that, that's probably the giveaway. My opponent EOT fetch and shocked a Watery Grave and didn't do anything. So now I'm assuming they're a Death Shadow deck. Like, I think they just tipped the hat there. Could go for Fatal Push into turn, but this is very clearly signaling like a Spell Pierce or a Stubborn Denial or something. So instead, we'll just go to our turn. Kill the Ragavan now. They do have the Spell Pierce. We get to soft stub it. Make use of all of our cards, trying to trade 2 for 2. I'm pretty good with aggressively trading 1 for 1 as much as I can there, because I figure I've got Murktide plus Counterspell or Murktide plus Drown, whatever the case may be. So I feel like I have a better hold of the late game. It's just about getting to the late game. Hearse is a little annoying there. Like, obviously, when I'm wanting to get down this Murktide or I've got Drawn in the Lock in hand, Hearse can be frustrating. If you've played a lot of Shadow Mirrors, especially the Grixis mirrors with like Gurmag Angler and Shadow and all that, you know that the majority of the time, or at the very least, the the schema for the matchup is that the first person that attacks with a shadow in the shadow mirror loses. Like if you got a shadow and I got a shadow, the first person that attacks with that shadow is probably losing. And I think that carries a lot of weight. And a lot of the reason for it is we trade off shadow sizes. So, for example, you hit me with a small shadow, my shadow's medium size. I hit you with a medium shadow. Your shadow's like slightly above medium. And if your shadow's not killing me right there, then you can no longer attack. Because if you do, my shadow outgrows and kills you on the backswing for sure. Um, Obviously, there's little bits and pieces where that doesn't always hold true, but for the most part, when like I'm ahead on cards and my opponent has a shadow and they're attacking at me, I feel phenomenal. Like, hey, I've got a bunch of answers to your shadow. You're down to now one card. Like we can do this tango here. Because at the end of the day, I know I'm going to be able to answer your shadow. I've got Fatal Push for yours, even if you have like a Stubborn Denial or Counterspell or whatever, then I can Drown and Lock that and keep my shadow alive. I was not expecting a Murktide out of them, so that was pretty cool. I thought maybe they would fire up the hearse. I guess they wouldn't because I'm not dead to it. But either way, they're empty handed now and they've got a Murktide. So I can obviously, like, if I had not drawn the fetch, things might have been a little bit different. But since I drew the fetch, now I get like probably easiest attack of my life. Because if my opponent blocks with the Murktide, then I just get to go, cool, fetch, outgrow the Murktide, kill it, go. If they fire up the hearse and go to block or want to go to block, I can Drown in the Lock, target the hearse. And if they let it resolve, then my shadow hits them, I win. If they eat their own graveyard, they have to tap the hearse to do it, to shut off the Drown in the Lock, in which case my shadow hits them and they die. So all roads lead to Rome. Crew the hearse, drown the hearse. You got no ability to exile the yard. And shadow gets there. My shadow gets there. So 2 shadow mirrors in the ManaTraders event is pretty cool. Really great to see other people playing shadow, obviously. But yeah, that's like pretty clean run with Dimir. Obviously, our losses, one was to the Rhinos player that I think we could have had a few better lines against, but it happens. And then the second loss was to the blue-white control player that hit the verdict, much as we hate to say it. But realistically, I don't think blue-white control is enough of a meta percentage to really be focusing on that matchup. Like, you'll see it from time to time, and it's probably going to suck if you run into it, but I wouldn't go out and say, hey, I need like a full sideboard overhaul to deal with blue-white control. I think if you have a sideboard plan right now for the Murktide Mirror, for blue-red Murktide, for Rhinos, Hammertime, Scam, Creativity, and then probably I wouldn't leave home without a plan for the Sultai Shadow matchup right now, which, again, I feel pretty confident against with this deck. For example, we've got 4 Fatal Pushes in the 75, Shieldred's Edicts, Drowning Locks that all answer all of their threats. We've got Archmage's Charm that can steal shadows. Dismember can deal with like small Tarmogoyfs. Murktide Regent outgrows everything except the largest Goyfs on their side. And they have very, very few ways of actually dealing with it. And And then like Unlicensed Hearse, EE out of the board are phenomenal. Path of Peril can just be like a one-sided board wipe if you have a Murktide. Dress Down stops Goyf for a turn plus draws a card, or puts Goyf into like Dismember range. So you can also have times where your opponent gets to Hex Mage, flip the invasion, and you can dress down after that's happened and they've attacked and be able to like blow out blocks because they're thinking they're just going to get like free damage through. So keep that in mind if you end up running into that matchup. Otherwise, as far as things I would change, I didn't like the Shieldred's Edict in the main. I really haven't been impressed with that card very much, and I think it's because a lot of our game plan in matchups that Shieldred's Edict shines, which is mostly against Planeswalkers, our game plan's like counter everything relevant anyway. So having something that relies on your opponent's like counterable thing resolving is kind of awkward. So I could easily see cutting that. Murktide itself, it feels like so bad when you see multiple Murktides, but it feels more bad when you don't see any at all. So I'm still not sure like where I want that number to be, but I'm hoping eventually it'll kind of like jump out at me. Oh, you want this number of Murktide. Brazen Borrower. I think if you're going for like most expected metas, I would just skip out on the Borrower. Like if you're expecting to see Hammertime, Creativity, Rhinos, Living End, Scam for the most part, then I'd probably just not run the Borrower. But if you're expecting to see literally anything and everything, then Borrower's pretty solid. Fourth Drowning Lock, I don't think was ever that bad. But somebody asked about me going back up to the fourth drown, and I basically gave the answer of like, drown may have been a little awkward once or twice, but it was never worse than anything I would be playing in that spot. And there were some times against like blue white control where Drown in the Lock looked a lot better than some of the other things it could be. As far as the sideboard goes, Spreading Seas has been an all-star. Like I don't think I would leave home without Spreading Seas. The number of times that we've just nuked an Urza Saga, drawn a card, is huge. And like if you're expecting a bunch of Saga decks, I might even consider going to a third. Urkel's Recall's been pretty decent. Dress Down's been phenomenal. Chalice of the Void's been pretty good. Shieldred's Edict, again, kind of on the fence. Turok's good in the matchups that Turok is good against. So, like, Turok's good against blue-white control. Really good against blue-white control. Really good against, like, the 4 or 5 color elemental piles with, like, Leyline Binding. Really awful in most fair matchups where you're just, like, looking for an extra threat. A lot of the time I'll bring in Turok against, like, Scam or Murktide, and it never really feels great in those matchups. But it also has to do with the fact that those are like Blood Moon matchups where you want islands pretty aggressively, and Turok obviously does not play well with islands. But in the matchups that it is good, especially against decks like Blue White Control, you can almost just play out a turn 2 Turok and like ride it to the win. So just keep that in mind. Yeah. So hope you enjoyed checking out the matches. We'll probably stream the deck sometime soon when I've got time. Otherwise, I know I'll be playing Shadow of some sort in next week's ManaTraders event. I don't know what my list is going to look like yet, but obviously we'll have an update probably on Discord first So if you're not already a member of the Discord, the link for that will be down below. I have the link to this deck list out so you can check it out. And yeah, that's about all I got. Hope you all have an awesome rest of your day. Stay safe, enjoy some good food and company. Catch you back live later. Adios for now.